More chemical reactions. This one's fun. So, this is another chemical reaction. We've already kind of partially talked about this one. This one's called combustion. However, there's another classification that we can group this in. This one's called an exothermic chemical reaction because heat is exiting the chemical reaction. You can tell, again, think about your evidence for chemical change. There's a whole bunch of things happening here. It's changing color. There's gas coming off of it. It's certainly changing from paper to other stuff. You can see the ash falling off of it. This is a chemical reaction. This is, again, classified as an exothermic chemical reaction. The material is burning. There's heat coming off of it. So there's exothermic chemical reactions and there's endothermic chemical reactions. We're going to talk about those. Messes in the name of science. So much ash. This is all that's left. This is all that's left of the paper. That's all I could hold on to before it got too hot. So, like I said, an exothermic chemical reaction is when a chemical is letting go of some heat. The two things start chemically reacting. In the case of the paper, there's oxygen going into the paper, and under the presence of some heat, it can release more heat and become those two things from combustion, carbon dioxide and water. There is another opposite type of chemical reaction to that. Some chemical reactions require heat. Heat needs to go into it. So I know that heat needed to go into the paper for it to start, but once the chemical reaction started, once the chain reaction started, it was releasing heat on its own. I didn't need to contribute any more fire to it. I didn't need to contribute more heat. It was continuously releasing its own heat. Other chemical reactions continuously absorb heat from their surroundings. Those are called endothermic chemical reactions. And we're going to do a couple of those in class because they're fun. And just need to know the important distinction between them. Exothermic chemical reactions release heat into their environment. Endothermic chemical reactions absorb heat into the chemical reaction. So two familiar processes that are reverses of each other, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, we're going to use those to talk about exothermic and endothermic chemical reactions. Let's have a look at those chemical reactions again. Photosynthesis is a process that trees undergo where they take carbon dioxide in the air, mix it with water. Those are the two chemical components. And then under the presence of energy, namely sunlight, they can fuse those together. Again, energy is going into the chemical reaction. So if the energy is going into it, it's on the reactants side of the chemical reaction, then it's called endothermic. What you get out of it, the products, in the case of photosynthesis, is sugar and oxygen. So those are the products. Now, cellular respiration, remember, it's the exact opposite of that. Photosynthesis makes the sugars. Plants make the sugars. We use them. That's why we ultimately rely on plants. They're the producers in a food chain. So we get the sugars from them eventually, somewhere down the food chain, and we take those sugars and we chemically combine them with oxygen, and out of that, the products, what we're getting out of it, are those same things. We're getting carbon dioxide back out and we're getting water back out, but we're also getting that energy back out. So when we're running around, when we're doing anything, you can definitely feel it when you're working out. You're releasing that heat. Our body has learned to harness that heat to do active things like move your muscles, pump your heart, breathe. Anything that requires energy, you use sugar to do that. And again, you can feel that heat when your body releases that energy. So photosynthesis is an endothermic chemical reaction because heat goes into it. It's on the reactants side of the chemical equation. And cellular respiration is a an exothermic chemical reaction because it's releasing heat into its environment. So, speaking of heat, let me pose a thought experiment to you. Does photosynthesis really work at all when there's no sunlight? Well, no. If there's no heat available, there's heat, but not in the specific form that's required of it. If that energy isn't available, the chemical reaction can't happen. Heat being present allows chemical reactions to happen more readily, allows them to happen faster. Like with the paper, when I burnt it, under the right circumstances, when I added heat to the chemical reaction, because there's oxygen surrounding the paper, and the oxygen it doesn't have enough energy to chemically combine with the paper. Once I give it the energy, once I give it the heat, suddenly the paper has enough energy to chemically react with the oxygen. So it starts doing that. But every time it does that, it releases even more heat, again, exothermic. So that heat, the presence of heat, can speed up chemical reactions. The opposite is also true. When you remove heat from a situation, the chemical reactions can also slow down. The take-home message from that is that different things can affect how fast a chemical reaction happens. The only thing really stopping the paper from chemically reacting with the oxygen is the available heat. If there's more, it can chemically react. That's why lightning strikes cause forest fires, because they provide that initial energy, that initial heat that's required to start burning the fire, and then all of the exothermic chemical reactions, when the leaves are burning, wood's burning, anything in the area is burning, is releasing more and more and more heat, and everything else can light up. But you need that initial heat. So there's four key things that affect the rate at which chemicals can react with each other. The first one was heat. Let's go back to our elephant toothpaste chemical reaction. The reason why I wasn't able to do it in class is because I had 3% hydrogen peroxide, which means that if you were to look at 100 molecules inside of the bottle, 3 of them would be hydrogen peroxide and the other 97 would be water. That chemical reaction for elephant toothpaste goes through a lot quicker. It happens a lot better when you have 50% hydrogen peroxide. So if I were to put 50% hydrogen peroxide, so for every 100 molecules, if I had that strong of a concentration, for every 100 molecules in 50% hydrogen peroxide, half of them would be, so 50 of them would be water, and the other 50 would be hydrogen peroxide. So why concentration matters is that when you the chemical reaction of hydrogen peroxide breaking down into hydrogen and oxygen, that it happens on its own, but there's simply having more of it there will allow that chemical reaction to happen faster. Now there's the elephant toothpaste is a great example of the rate of reaction, because there was another key ingredient in that chemical reaction that was important. That was the potassium iodide. It doesn't actually chemically react with the hydrogen peroxide at all. What it actually does is it catalyzes the chemical reaction. Its presence allows the hydrogen peroxide to break down faster. A catalyst is something that allows a chemical reaction to proceed much more quickly. You'll learn about how it does that more if you take chemistry in high school, but for now, what you need to understand is that the presence of catalyst can speed up the chemical reaction. So when I added the potassium iodide, or when somebody who's doing the elephant toothpaste experiment adds potassium iodide to the hydrogen peroxide, they cause that hydrogen peroxide to break down into oxygen and hydrogen gas much more quickly. So a couple things going on there. Again, the higher the concentration, the more readily it will react, and also the the presence of a catalyst allows that chemical reaction to happen quicker. So the fourth factor that affects how fast chemical reactions can occur is the surface area. So I'm going to go back to burning another piece of paper to help explain this. The more surface area that's exposed to the fire, the faster the chemical reaction will happen. I can do that by turning the paper into the fire. As I turn the paper into the fire, let's get it started. As I turn the paper into the fire, more of the paper is exposed to the heat, so that chemical reaction can accelerate. But if I turn it the other way, and remember heat rises, the chemical reaction slows down quite a bit. There's less of the paper that's exposed to the heat, so it slows down a bunch. Again, it's all about surface area. The more surface area that's exposed, the faster the chemical reaction can happen. And again, if I turn it and expose more of the paper, it can really quickly take off, and the chemical reaction speeds up again. Try not to burn my desk. Great. The same is true. Another example of that would be like if I had a very loosely packed piece of paper and a very tightly packed piece of paper. The loosely packed one has much more surface area in which the oxygen can surround it. Like the oxygen can get inside of here, so the chemical reaction between the oxygen in the air in here and the paper, that's a lot more likely to happen, as there's more places where those two chemicals are actually coming in contact with each other. So there's more area in the molecule available. If I densely pack a piece of paper, the chemical reaction is going to happen slower. The only oxygen that can access the paper is just the stuff on the outside. And think about it. Like, look at the amount of available oxygen that would be available to chemically react with this paper. It's just this tiny little bit on the outside of the paper. That's it. That's all of the oxygen that can chemically react with this. Very different from exposing it like this. All of the oxygen is all this stuff out here, all of the inside, all of the outside. There's so much more surface area available for that chemical reaction to happen. So when I light these two up, there will be a very different rate of reaction. And I'll light from the bottom and let it just go straight up. So lighting this piece of paper, there's a lot more available space for the chemical reaction to happen, so it's going to burn hot and it's going to burn fast. Woo! Again. So really hot, really fast. So now let's go to this one and do the same thing, but with the little ball of fire. Again, it should chemically react a lot slower. Can't even get started. Doing the exact same technique, holding it straight up, it doesn't even sustain itself. There's just not enough of a connection between the oxygen and the material. So even lighting it from the bottom, keeping the fire on it for longer to see if I can really get it going, it's just without that much space for the oxygen to actually contact it, it burns much, much slower. There's just, I can't even sustain it. Even holding it upright, it barely is holding on to the fire, and it's going to go out. It's gone. It can't even chemically react with it. Because again, there's just not that much space for the oxygen to actually get in there and chemically react with the paper. And that was very different when I have a tightly packed ball versus the loose one. In the loose one, again, remember, there's so much space in there where the oxygen can chemically react with the paper. So you end up with a much faster chemical reaction. So surface area is another thing that affects the rate. Oh, the smoke. Surface area is another thing that affects how fast a chemical reaction can happen. The more surface area, the more available room for those two chemicals to actually come in contact, the faster a chemical reaction can happen. I've just got one question for you. What are those? The ending result of our chemical reactions, of course. Higher surface area, smoldering ashes, lower surface area, hardly touched. Well, let's recap. There's two types of chemical reactions involving heat. There's exothermic chemical reactions in which heat is released into the environment. It exits the chemical reaction. And then there's endothermic chemical reactions where heat enters the chemical reaction and actually makes the area around it colder as it's absorbing heat. Heat can affect how fast a chemical reaction happens. If there's more heat available for both endothermic and exothermic chemical reactions, if there's more heat available for an exothermic chemical reaction, there's more heat that can start that chemical reaction between the two chemicals. Also for an endothermic chemical reaction though, if there's more heat available, if the area surrounding the chemical reaction is hotter, it can absorb that heat quicker. So in both cases, more heat availability means a faster chemical reaction. There are a couple other ways to change the rate a chemical can react. One being a catalyst. A catalyst is like a helper. It helps the chemical reaction happen quicker. It doesn't chemically react with the material, it just helps the chemical reaction happen faster. That's again called a catalyst. Two other ways, one being the concentration. Concentration is pretty straightforward. If there's more of the material there to chemically react, it'll happen faster. And then finally, surface area. The more surface area available, the more exposed, the more area of exposure between the two chemicals. Like when I was burning the paper, the looser the piece of paper, the more oxygen was actually in contact with the paper. So the faster the chemical reaction can happen. The other way, reducing surface area, if I reduce the amount of surface area available by compacting the ball, in other words, there's less oxygen in contact with the paper, the chemical reaction slows down. So rate of reaction is affected by four things: the presence of heat, a catalyst, the presence of a catalyst, I should say, the available surface area, and the available materials, like the concentration. The more materials, the faster it can chemically react. So that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Till next time.